All right, everybody. So today we have on the podcast Menno Henselmans. How you doing, Menno?
My pleasure. Yeah, good.
Yeah. So as I was saying before recording, it's shocking to me that I've taken this long to get you on, and it's not because like I asked and you turned me down or anything like that. I just, for whatever reason, it's just taken me a long time to reach out. And Abel Shabai, who also has the podcast, and I keep saying I got to get Menno on at some point. So finally, we're making it happen. And I appreciate you taking the time. So before we get into all of the questions, as always, we start with a charity donation, and you just tell us which you picked and why.
So Nets to prevent malaria. And I think I did some research on where the money is most effectively used. And that one actually came out super high. And I looked at a few others that were also rated high, but they suffered a bit from giving a man fish rather than teaching them how to fish. Mm-hmm. And I think with the Nets, you give them extra tools. And it seems like a little, money against cancer or everything, or some child welfare thing always ranks higher, but in terms of feelings. But if you actually look at like preventing deaths, and of course, if people don't die from malaria, it allows them to build a bigger culture and civilization and everything. Health sort of is the foundation for all of these things. So it's not very flashy. I think it's a very productive way where you have relatively little money for us actually makes a very big difference for other people.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. Emotionally, it's definitely not the first thing that people think of.
Yeah, it's not like, whoa, that's like salvation,
right. But it's actually just like the top, like, I don't know, 5 to 10 charities as far as like money in goes to lives saved are almost all like malaria foundations and whatnot.
Yeah.
So
because it's relatively easy to prevent.
Right.
Like a net, a net to prevent malaria it really doesn't cost much, and for them it's literally a lifesaver.
Yeah.
Whereas if you compare that to investing in research against cancer, it's like, well, we've been looking at that for a long time with a lot of smart people, and we haven't really gotten breakthrough yet. It costs a lot of money to invest in that. Maybe it goes nowhere. So
totally.
The flashiest things really aren't always the most effective.
Yeah.
Charities and in life in general.
Yeah. So let's see. So recently, some of the things I know I wanted to talk to you about, Refeeds is a big one, and we'll kind of get into all that. And then I know recently there was kind of the debate as far as that whole P ratio debate going on. I think I had briefly discussed it. I had Eric Trexler on, discussed it. And I think people who are really interested probably have seen some of the stuff already. Just kind of circling back to it, is there anything that you would have changed as far as like your arguments, or that you have a different thought process now compared to a couple months ago, let's say, before the debate?
Not in the big lines, but I think Eric and Greg did a good job of highlighting that it's important to emphasize there's not direct evidence. It's not like we have 10 studies showing if you're overweight, you have a very difficult time gaining muscle. It's more like there are various lines of reasoning that suggest being overweight has various detrimental effects, like recovery capacity. Just, I think, 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago, after the debate at least, there was a new review paper that concluded, overweight individuals indeed have quite significantly poorer recovery capacity. Like it takes them longer to recover from a given workout. That in itself, for me, is already a very strong line of evidence, at least not to recommend bulking up to very high body fat percentages, unless you have a good reason to, maybe a powerlifting weight class or something. Because logically speaking, if it takes you longer to recover from a given workout, then your total volume that you can handle or with a given frequency is going to be lower. And that means less volume, all else equal, typically means less gains. Like I'm a pretty big component of relatively high volume training suited to the individual. Basically, like Mike's MRV, like Mike Israel's maximum recoverable volume. I tend to agree with that. Implementation is a bit different, but I like pushing volume up to the level where people can still recover from it, and they accumulate as much productive volume as they can. I think if you look at research on rest intervals, for example, on training frequency, that most research errs towards that being the case.
Yeah, and I should have started with this, but for people who maybe didn't catch something about the debate, so P ratio, we're looking at basically the proportion of fat to muscle that's gained, right? When somebody's, okay, so 20% body fat, is it still a good idea to bulk or not? And generally speaking, you are more on the favor of getting leaner first and doing that, I guess, for a number of reasons before bulking up, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what if you had an ideal, and of course, obviously genetics and preferences are going to play here, but generally, what would you like to see somebody cut down to before beginning, let's call it like a lean massing phase?
So I think there's reasonable evidence, at least, not to be overweight. And it depends a bit on which standards you look at. But for men, that's like 21% body fat. For women, about 10% higher. I think 33 is typically used as a cutoff. And probably quite a bit below that if you want to be really safe. I think for women, this is really a mood issue because pretty much all of my female clients, at least, prefer being leaner. And the issue is rather them not being too lean. Like they may prefer to be leaner than they should be for hormonal health, at least. Rather than, and for guys, it's a question of some guys want to keep bulking and massing, or they're like a bit skinny, fat, overweight, and they're like, what do I need to do to look better? And I need to put on muscle. And I think both aesthetically and in terms of long-term progression, the answer is it's probably better to cut first in the majority of cases.
Yeah, I can only think of one woman I've trained who wanted to bulk up past the body fat that like I thought was a good idea. Almost everyone else across the board is like, no, like I want to get leaner. And so definitely depends on the population. Now, I knew you were in favor of higher volumes, and it sounds like you're saying basically, as far as my understanding is, you're not a fan of ramping volume and kind of resetting and ramping. So you mentioned the different implementation. So you would kind of just be at what would be an MRV for somebody and more or less just stay there. I assume, well, I was going to say, I assume occasional deloads, but I'm not sure if you're a big fan of deloads.
Not really, not like the traditional deload weeks, at least.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I use what's called reactive deloads, or that's how I call it. And they're more exercise specific. So I use quite a lot of them. And typically the structure is something like if you're not progressing as planned, or your progress is below a certain threshold, for example, it's 2 reps lower than it should be, then you skip all remaining sets or you do speed work. I'm typically a fan of speed work. Some research shows that it may still help with strength development and technique development, whereas it has a very low cost in terms of neuromuscular fatigue. Plus, people tend to prefer it because depending on the population, when someone fails in the gym, sometimes people just want to push harder and they dig themselves just deeper into their own recovery hole. They're like, next set, I'm going to get it. And if you didn't get it the first set and you're training hard, there's very little chance you're going to get it the next set, because you're now even more fatigued. So, and then if the cause of that plateau was that you've not fully recovered from your previous session, then what you're doing is by ramping up on the next set and going to failure again, you're digging yourself just deeper into your recovery hole. So I think what you need to do is lay off, but you don't always know when you're going to need to do this.
Yeah.
And the once every 4 week thing is like, it can work, but I think it's arbitrary, and I like to do things more both body part specific and when needed. So that's the idea of a reactive deload. Is many people don't need a full body deload. If your upper body or even just your biceps is not progressing, that does not mean you should skip leg extensions today.
Sure.
So in general, most of these central nervous system fatigue or any types of central fatigue has been widely overblown. There's been a review paper out, I think last month or so, that actually concluded that central nervous system fatigue in general is mostly a trivial concern for strength trainees.
Yeah.
It may be more of a concern actually for rest intervals and those kind of things, rather than for long-term fatigue, because it seems like central nervous system fatigue is more like software. If you open Word 10,000 times and close it, the software doesn't fatigue. It's a system, it goes on and off, and the brain is a bit like that. Rather, it recovers super, super fast if there is any fatigue in the first place. And it mostly seems to fatigue only with endurance training, which causes more systemic stress in terms of hormones and energy depletion, rather than strength training, which just isn't high volume enough. It's not enough total work that the body has to do. Right.
Interesting. So, and I might have missed it there. So you say per session or just per body part, or I should say, or per exercise?
Yeah. The implementation is typically per exercise. Okay. You can also do it per body part, depending on your program. For example, if you plateau on the bench press, then you're also going to skip flies later on.
Yeah.
But I found that I typically don't do it that way. Maybe a bit excessive. especially if your training frequency is low.
Yeah.
Because if you just had a bad day or your technique was off, then you're missing maybe, if you're training twice a week, every body part, you're missing half a week of progression just because of that, because you were, overly conservative.
So, and again, obviously, I'm sure you structure different people's routines differently, but generally speaking, is there a type of, just because my follow-up question will pertain to this, are you more a fan of full body or certain splits? How do you tend to program?
Yeah, I've become sort of the high frequency guy.
Yeah.
Which I guess is fair, because I definitely err on the side of higher frequencies. And I think as a whole in the literature, if you look at especially trained individuals, but it's also true in untrained individuals, I think there are now maybe a dozen studies on training frequency. The majority find no difference in results. But if you specifically look at the studies where the higher training frequencies result in more total work done, there is definitely a trend towards, which it should, right? If you're splitting your workout in two, you should do more total work. Because, if you do 6 sets of bench presses on Monday, then by set 6, you're super fatigued. Whereas if you do 3 on Monday, 3 on Thursday, then you're more fresh on Thursday. You should be able to get more reps and do more total work. So if you look at studies where that's the case, which I think are more ecologically valid of how we practice things, then there is definitely a trend. And in general, there are, I think, 5 or so studies where there either is, at least on a few measures, a significant improvement in favor of the high frequency group or a trend. And in contrast, there is only one study in one of 5 muscle groups where the lower frequency group for the biceps had greater gains. And there it wasn't really the case that the gains were so great in the low frequency group. It was rather that for some reason, the high frequency group didn't seem to make gains. However, I did have a research review which had very weak support showing that maybe the biceps actually reacts a little bit more poorly to higher frequencies and volumes than other muscle groups.
Okay, yeah. That I'd not heard before. So, so let's say you're doing 3 times a week. Your version of a deload might literally be that just one exercise of one body part of that week has that kind of back off, and everything else you could treat the same as long as it hasn't suffered from the previous session.
Exactly. The exercises that you see are suffering, those you deload, the rest you don't, very much.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I could certainly see the arguments against it, one of which you already brought up, the systemic issue. But obviously it's something that works for you. So, and I, on the whole, I agree of being reactive. I think, especially for those who do trend towards lower volumes and lower frequencies, the idea that, hey, every 4th week I need to take off, I don't think it really is necessary. I think, like you said, you can still progress, but is that the best way? Maybe not. So one of the big things I wanted to get into that has really been an area that I've been more open to changing my mind in the last probably year or so is refeeds. And I just had Dr. Bill Campbell on. He wanted me to say thank you, by the way, for helping fund the study going on. But he had the study showing the positive benefits of refeeds. Obviously, there was the Matador study. And it was actually Abel was one of the people who has really been against refeeds, and we've had a number of discussions about it, and pros and cons and all that. And so I have definitely lessened my stance, which used to be very strong refeed, in large part because everybody I knew did them. I just thought like it was just universally accepted that like, no, of course you do them now. And now I'm still a fan of them, but no longer to the same extent. And so I would just kind of like, generally speaking, for people who don't know, you're not a huge fan of them. Maybe just a quick reason as to why, and then we can get into that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think my background in this case helped me a lot because I didn't get in like traditional bro bodybuilding culture or anything. I sort of started from kind of nowhere and just looking at the research. Like I studied mostly statistics, behavioral economics, and then fitness was a passion, but I wasn't into the muscle max and those kind of things. Right. I got some exposure to it more when I got into the fitness industry, but it was never, most people, they're sort of first taught the bro methods, and then they have to find out which parts are true. And for me, it was just like refeeds. I had never seen the term in any literature. It's basically a foreign concept. I think now there are some papers that use the term, but over the last, barring the last couple of years, it's a term that you could not find, much like carb cycling. It's basically something that's completely made up in terms of science.
Right.
Like there's no paper even looking at it, mentioning it. The term itself is not used. So refeeds are actually a bit like that. And there is research on, intermittent energy restriction and the like, which paints a bit of a continuum from like refeed to diet break, which is like a long refeed is like a diet break.
Mm-hmm.
And it's generally not really positive. Like there's very little direct research, which, it itself should make you somewhat skeptical. But most of the research on leptin and markers of increased energy expenditure are very, how you call it, disappointing. Like the increase in energy expenditure you get from even overfeeding like 50-40%, which is massive dreamer bulking, right? That's typically involves fat gain even from day 1 or 2 onward. And you're looking at like 5% increase in energy expenditure. And much of that is really just the thermic effect of food that you eat. So it's not really that your basal metabolic rate goes up appreciably. It's just that you eat more food, it costs some energy to digest and absorb those nutrients. And the leptin, which is typically used as like the main mechanism, like you increase leptin levels a lot. But we have very strong research showing that leptin responds to cumulative total energy balance and total adipose tissue, which makes sense because adipose tissue, your fat mass, is what secretes and produces the leptin in large part. So you can't really trick leptin. Research finds that if you go back into energy deficit, the leptin goes back down. So we don't have good studies directly looking at if you do the refeed and you keep monitoring leptin levels, but we do have studies where leptin levels are monitored over time, not with like refeed scenarios, but with energy surplus and deficit. And then you typically see it just goes up and down with it. So there's no indication that we can trick our leptin levels like that. So yes, if you do a refeed, your leptin levels go up, energy expenditure goes up a little bit. But when you go into deficit, it most likely goes back down. Like all indications are the leptin levels go back down, and there isn't like some delay or anything. You basically have to offset the entire energy surplus before leptin levels. So basically, if you offset the entire energy surplus, then basically all you've achieved is you've lost some time,
right?
Or lean bulks maybe for a few days.
Yeah, right.
Positive case. I think
go ahead.
One case where refeeds are useful and where I sometimes actually use them is if you're unintentionally in too aggressive energy deficit. And I think anecdotally also that's where the success stories come from, in that many people diet far too aggressively and then compensate for it somewhat with a refeed. And then it's better to have the refeed than to just crash diet. Because if you just crash diet, you just lose muscle, etc. Whereas if you find yourself in excess energy deficit, you can do sort of a refeed to rescue the situation a bit and make sure that you're not crash dieting. But I think then you're better off just more moderately dieting continuously rather than having these low energy and then, big energy eating, especially in terms of diet adherence and the like. Yeah. Most research finds consistency, routines, those things really pay off. And it's funny because in fitness is the only realm of like psychology and nutritional sciences where you can have someone that says, look, what I do is 5 days of the week during the midweek, I completely starve myself. And then in the weekend, I completely let go and I don't train and I eat a lot. What do you think of that? That's good for adherence, right? If you tell that to a psychologist, they're like, that's binge eating 101.
Yeah, right. So wasn't one of your critiques of the Matador study that they saw positive results due to increased adherence that maybe wasn't measured?
Mm-hmm. Probably. In most of these studies, what you find is that people can basically maintain their results for 6 months max. If you get like people that aren't willing to diet, like you have them random people basically, and like we're gonna have you diet because you're in a study on weight loss. Mm. Or in general, obese people or overweight individuals that aren't super intrinsically motivated. If they're, for example, like, now is as good as time as any because I've got this study and the people watch me. It's very hard to get them sustainably leaner. And if you look at the Matador results, you can see basically that the diet breaks, which were, I think it's 2 weeks every 2 weeks in the Matador study, at least a lot of extra time. Mm. They basically kept them on a bit longer in terms of their adherence, whereas the fast group already achieved the final results like 2/3 into the study, I think, and then sort of didn't really progress anymore. Right. But if they had cut the study off there, then the results would have been much better for the group without the diet breaks. And basically what the refeeds did is allowed them to stay on track a bit longer. But I think that's not really an indication of diet adherence for someone that's more motivated. because if you look at most studies on diet breaks, I think there are now 4 or so, most find either no change in adherence, like the wing study was one of the first ones where they actually expected worse adherence, but didn't find it. But there were some trends for like people saying it was a bit harder to get back into your routines. And I've seen it with clients for sure, when people say, if you haven't trained for a certain period, it can be very difficult to get back at it, for example. And with dieting, it can be a little bit the same. Like normally, if you create a meal plan, then you have to get back at like, oh, what were my food choices? I have to change my shopping habits, those kind of things.
Yeah.
It's minor, but if anything, the trend errs towards the diet breaks being more detrimental rather than beneficial.
So just if I'm understanding correctly, I don't remember the exact length of the Matador study, but let's say it was 14 versus whatever, like 26 weeks, because there wasn't that extra like 2 week there.
I think it was like only 8 weeks of actual dieting. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe it was like 8 versus 14 weeks or something.
Yeah.
In that situation, remind me, weren't the results at say like week 14 for the diet break study superior than like week 8? Like basically once all of the dieting was done, it was superior in that one study, right, in the diet break. So yeah. I guess what I'm saying is if your goal is, hey, we just want you to get there and we want you to do the best way possible. In that one study, wasn't it showing like that was superior? And one of your arguments was that it was due to increased compliance. But I think maybe you're saying in the real world, you feel like it actually could lead to decrease in compliance. I'm just trying to find the discrepancy there and maybe explain it.
Yeah, I don't think that study is very representative. Also, the results they found like superior. I think lean mass loss, for example, was in absolute terms a bit higher in the group with the diet breaks. The fat loss was greater, but also a bit more lean mass loss. And the crucial thing is that when you equate for the time difference, I'm pretty sure you would have gotten better results if you had just at 2/3. You would have cut off the group that didn't have a diet break and just told them, okay, from now on start lean bulking.
Yeah.
Or just let's dial it down a bit, maybe go into like 5% deficit and just try to maintain that, or even a maintenance phase or something,
Right.
Because anything that's already difficult to sustain for an overweight individual, like you're never going to get six-pack lean.
Right.
Those are not sustainable diet habits. Like a contest prep is different. Like I can totally see that reasoning. If someone's like, I want to do a contest and it's freaking hard to get contest lean. You're like, I need some diet breaks to get there. Like otherwise I'll go insane. Like it's going to take me longer. It may not be optimal, but I just want to get there. Then I could totally see that reasoning. But for like the average individual, if you need diet breaks to make like a little change in body composition for like an 8-week diet, how on earth are you going to drop 10 kilos and be six-pack lean for the next 2 decades? Because that's typically, at least my clients, what they want. They want to be sustainably lean where it feels like, ideally the scenario I'm in, for example, I can get six-pack lean pretty much effortless. I just change, I do something strategically different, but I never feel hungry or really deprived or anything. If I have to get below that, it's going to get difficult. Like contest lean, it is going to be effortful. I need to be very meticulous in which kind of restaurants I go. At some point, basically no more restaurants, etc. But getting just six-pack lean is pretty doable. I don't track my calories either. Like it's all ad libitum. Yeah. Bulking, you have to be a bit more meticulous. I think ad libitum doesn't work well for bulking, but that's another story. And that's basically the scenario where I want people to get. And I think that's very possible, at least if you train multiple times per week.
So if I'm understanding correctly, you're basically saying, generally speaking, yes, they can be helpful if you're doing an extreme deficit, but you would really just recommend them not do the extreme deficit in the first place. And then for a contest prep, I guess one argument would say, well, couldn't you just have a less extreme deficit to get there? And I guess what you're saying is that ultimately getting to contest lean is such an unpleasant experience that even if you go slow, you're going to need some sort of break.
Yeah, I don't think you'll need it, but some people might want it, might strongly prefer it,
Gotcha.
So I don't think it's strictly necessary to do diet breaks to get contest lean.
Okay.
Actually, I'm pretty sure it's not. Like most of my clients don't. But because for some people really don't like it. They're like, I just prefer the consistency, the routine, etc. I don't want to take my foot off the gas pedal and just want to keep going, But for other people, yeah, the necessity of a diet break in itself should really make you wonder that what you're doing right now, because the fact you need a break is, by definition, that's the strongest sign you can have that what you're doing right now is not sustainable.
Mm-hmm. So, and I would argue, I guess, maybe like some people, like on the whole, I do agree with most of that. I think to some extent, I think it's really good, especially as a coach, that you are looking for what is sustainable. I do think that what you need to get there is generally will be more aggressive than what you need to stay there, right? It's a lot harder to get to 10% body fat than to stay at 10% body fat. So, like for instance, almost everybody I know who is in favor of refeeds does not use refeeds for maintenance. They use it to diet down, and then once they get to maintenance, they will drop the refeeds, slowly bring up calories, and maintain there. I know maybe one person who actually consistently refeeds while staying lean. And he's not contest lean, but he probably stays about 8%, 8-9% year round. And he does like 3 low days, 1 high day. He just likes it. But do you find that like maybe some people are just successful with using it to diet down, and then once they get there, they can just kind of get rid of them to maintain?
I think it won't be more successful than another approach. I think calorie cycling can be very effective. I do sort of the opposite kind of calorie cycling. I prefer more low days, like 5-2 kind of diet. I think research generally errs towards that being at least as good, and possibly, and I think 2 studies, it's better for diet adherence. Like people, and that's even a suboptimal implementation. I never do complete fasts. I do like protein sparing modified fasts. And if you time that, especially on rest days, I think that's a more healthy way to do it. And then you have basically like 2 days where you do have to really effortfully diet in the week, but the rest of the week is much easier. I think that's at least equal to constant daily energy deficit. You can also do the reverse with some at least moderate diet breaks. You have some more higher days rather than low days. Like it depends on how you look at it, right? Because I say I have 5 high days, 2 low days, but when it becomes 4, you wouldn't say like I have 4 low days, 3 high days. Well, then you're more looking at, then it would be a refeed, I guess. Then you have 3 refeed days.
Well, that's when I first heard about this method, I was a little perplexed because I've been hearing like Menno doesn't like refeeds, he doesn't like refeeds, doesn't like refeeds. Oh, by the way, he incorporates this kind of like cycling strategy, and I thought that was kind of odd. But it sounds like you're saying like you don't even think it's that. It may be psychologically it's easier, but results-wise, you don't think it's going to be that much better than just a constant deficit.
No, so. But the trend is towards that low days might be a little better, and there's like some weak evidence, like the Variety review, suggesting that aggressive short-term deficits might reduce lean body mass loss. So it's important to note that the Matador study has now been replicated basically twice. First by Pios et al. I think you probably heard about it, Jackson Pios' study. And then we did a very similar study, and both found 0 body composition advantage in strength training individuals that actually quite meticulously track their macros, or at least are used to it and everything.
Right. And then I don't know if the one that Bill Campbell's doing is what you're referring to.
Yes, exactly. That's what Bill Campbell and I are currently working on. It's finished, and the results are very similar.
Right. So, yeah, he did mention that. Yeah, it's probably, because not a ton changes as far as like what works over the years. But this is probably the topic that I have most been open, like I said, to kind of, I still do enjoy them personally. But it's now like with clients, it's much more preference based than it is that I think it's like, like hard stop needed. For those who find that, hey, I've been dieting, and then, like kind of like the classic story of like, oh, I fell off the wagon and all of a sudden I lost weight. Right now, we're not talking when somebody falls off the wagon and has 10,000 calories, but, maybe 4,000 or something. I think it's generally accepted that that's just, water loss and things like that. When that happens, though, or you have somebody who is retaining a lot of water, if you don't like to, let's say, implement a refeed to help with that, like what do you like to do for those dieters other than just say, hey, just wait and it'll eventually come off?
Yeah, exactly that. Just wait.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And don't worry. I think one of the biggest lessons is don't worry about daily weight fluctuations, because it quickly simply becomes obsessive, and your daily weight will fluctuate sometimes significantly and occasionally enormously due to changes in your digestive mass, total body hydration status, and glycogen storage, which also changes hydration status. So if one day maybe you have a bit more carbs, a bit more sodium, and you drank an extra glass of water before you stepped on a scale, then even if it's the last day and you haven't peed it out yet, you're talking, you can be 2 kilos heavier, and that's zero change in actual total adipose or lean body mass. Well, lean body mass without water.
Yeah.
So it's, I think that's a big lesson for people. And in general, bloating and hydration status, I think, are more influenced by food choices. Like I think FODMAPs are a really underrated topic, where people, almost everyone, I dare say, has some food intolerances to some degree, like even mild ones, or just mild ones. And bodybuilders, they don't consider that at all, like the traditional bodybuilders. The idea of FODMAPs, like most don't even know what it is, like fermentable carbs.
Yeah.
That can cause a lot of gas production and water retention in the abdominal tract, in the gut. And that makes you bloated and can make you look fatter. But it's just a matter of food choices and digestive processes.
Yeah.
Like, well, there's no research on if it affects your body composition, but there's no mechanism by which it should or could. Maybe gut microbiota, but I think the last review on gut microbiota suggested you're looking at like a 3% difference in energy expenditure. So yes, if your gut microbiota is optimized, you can eat 3% more calories, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I thought it was funny what you said about the calorie cycling, because I do remember those days when like that was like the key, right? Everyone's like, calorie cycling, this is how bodybuilders do it. And I had one coach who every single day, this is like, I was like in high school at the time, and he, every day, he called it zigzagging, and there was like an exact number of calories to hit, and one day was 50 up, 200 down. It was just like, what are we doing? But I do agree with the low days. Like I actually have one 24-hour fast per week, and not because I think fasting is anything amazing, but I do like to incorporate once a week, and I do it on Monday. And like most people, I allow myself a little bit more on the weekends. I'm very busy at work, so I literally don't even think about it. It's actually a nice break. And then when I come home, I still have like a 1,500 calorie meal, but now that's all I've had for a day. So it's very easy to do that. And it really wouldn't be that hard if I decided to. I don't know if I would incorporate more than 2 days like super low like that. But it would be pretty easy for me to say, hey, on Thursday, I'm going to do the same thing. And I just created a significant deficit without really thinking much about it.
So if you'd also do it on Thursday, or it depends on my clients, usually I align it with the number of rest days, max 3, then that's pretty much my method. Although I do preserve the meal structure. Like I don't have like one meal for 1,500. I'll still have like maybe 3 meals with 500.
Yeah. So with your high frequency, high volume, I think you said there, you put it on the rest day, right? And then do you bother at all with like, okay, some people would used to say, have your larger calorie days or whatever with like your back or legs day? Do you try to make the day after or before these kind of lower calorie days anything specific? Do you not get that detailed?
No. I think for one, the energy expenditure difference is generally trivial, especially in my kind of programs where I divide the volume very equally and err towards more full body workouts. Like if you had like lag days, maybe then it would be a consideration. But I'm definitely not a fan of lag days. Like not just in terms of personal preference, but squats and deadlifts on the same day are not my preference.
Yeah.
And so for one, it's micromanagement. But there is something, I think, to the training rest day thing, because if you think about it, the way most people set up their programs, so most people will say, well, it doesn't really matter, your day to day. But if you have 2,500 calories every day, and that's like your target deficit, and your energy expenditure is like 2,000, or like 2,000 is your let's say you're consuming 2,000, 2,500 is like your energy expenditure, so that's 500 deficit, and then it's like 500 calories with training energy expenditure. What happens then is you can often see that you're actually in deficit on your training days because you have the same energy intake every day, but now the training puts you in the deficit, and on your rest days, you're in energy surplus. So that's, intuitively, I would think that's not optimal. We do know that mTOR, for example, is sensitive to total energy status, like AMPK and energy depletion decreases mTOR signaling acutely, not just chronically. I think chronically is probably the most important for leptin and the like, but I would not bet my money on it. At least there's little research on this, but I do think that fueling the anabolic window with calories in that period, like we have a few studies showing that having more of your daily calories in the period between the workout and bedtime is better than having more of the calories in the morning and then working out later, or training fasted and then having calories only very later in the day.
Right.
So there are some research indications that it's good to have more of your calories in the anabolic window period. And by that, I don't mean like the anabolic people myth of like 1 hour post-workout,
right,
but like the whole period of muscle growth after the workout, which is at least a day.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a study, I don't remember the author, but it was maybe a year ago. And it was basically on like protein timing. And they had concluded that, basically spreading protein evenly throughout the day was better than, like breaking it up. And so, or like having it like low, medium, high. And not that I would suggest that it's not better to have it evenly spread, but one of the issues I had with the study was they had the breakfast group, and they basically had a group that was working out in the morning and then not having their large protein bolus until that night. And so I said, okay, maybe the timing having it evenly spread matters, but the biggest issue I see here is you're doing a workout, having 7 grams of protein, and then not eating again for like 6 hours.
Yeah.
And I think if they had worked out specifically when that high protein bolus was, they might have found very little difference between the groups.
Yeah, I think the timing in relation to the workout is more important than the fact that it's even per se.
Yeah, definitely.
So actually, I err on the side of slightly uneven towards the workout.
Yeah, same. I know for you, you've talked about how you have a very adaptable metabolism. Mm-hmm. And I believe you said you cut on like maybe 1,800 calories. When you're bulking up, is it closer to like 5,000?
Yeah, 5,000 is when I have higher activity level with bicycling to the gym, for example, 20 minutes both ways. Mm-hmm. Then I sort of peak there, and then I'm like chubby end of bulk.
Yeah.
Usually it's like in between, it's like on the low 4,000s that I bulk mostly at.
What is chubby for Menno? Like I'm sure you're not sitting at 20+%.
No, that means like even flexed, the six pack is very, very vague.
Okay. All right. So I don't know, maybe 15, 16%?
No, I think that's actually like maybe even 18.
Okay. And obviously distribution,
Yeah, distribution matters. But I think many people have this idea that if they have like a little bit of ab visibility, they're almost 10%.
Right.
Whereas 10% is actually like full six pack.
Sure.
And many people at 15% is still like abs, especially if you're muscular. Mm-hmm. Then it's still like, pretty good abs. Probably not the low ones, and more like when flexed, 4-pack when flexed, sort of.
Right.
And I think almost all estimates are completely off because most people get their body fat estimates from these silly photos.
Sure.
Which is just one person that slammed together 6 photos, put some numbers to them, zero validation, but then a million other people look at those, and those become the reference that everyone uses.
Right.
Plus, calipers and BIEA are most commonly available, and both systematically underestimate body fat percentage, especially in trained individuals. You have these people that step on scale, and I'm a 2% body fat.
Yeah.
Like, are you in a coffin? No, because then it's not correct.
I am actually a fan of calipers, but not for specific percentages. I think they can be useful to track the actual values. So, okay, you have this, you have a 15 millimeter skin fold. You are watching that. So even though your weight didn't go down because of whatever reason, you see it's down 2 or 3 millimeters. Great. I don't put any stock in the actual percentages, especially because I seem to just be squishy. And so like my calipers, like I'll look, 13%. And the caliper, like on a calculator, will tell me like 7 or 8%. Like that's always been, and I do tend to hold water a lot, so that's maybe part of it. But it like way underestimates me. But even like you said, even on like and the average person, it probably underestimates it by 3-4% or something. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, that's exactly how I recommend you use calipers. I did create my own formula to make caliper readings more accurate, which is basically just a weighted sum of all the different formulas that are validated in trained populations. And then gender specific, because it obviously varies a lot for men and women because they have a very different body fat distribution. But even that formula, I can give it to people in my PT course. Like if you have no ID, then this is probably better than nothing, and it's as good as it gets. But even visually, just estimating it is probably about as accurate if you are experienced.
Yeah.
So what I do on my PT course, I have a lot of people look at photos of people that took DEXA scans or in-body or underwater weighing, like some 3C or 4C method that's actually reliable. And if you look at a lot of those photos, you get some idea of, what a certain body fat percentage is.
Yeah, no, I think it's almost like if you have, an identity tied to a percentage, a DEXA can be kind of disheartening when you see, and like you said, there can be issues with it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've had decent abs and I got a DEXA, I think at like 16% or something like that.
Right.
So, and now I know you're like generally lean most of the time. You're pretty tall, right? Are you like 6'1", 6'2"?
Yeah, I'm 6'1".
Okay. So when you bulked up, are you in like what, like 210, 215 range?
Yeah, I'm now a good 93 kilos, which is I'm typically over 200.
Okay.
Before contest, I'll dip below 200 for like photo shoot contest.
Yeah.
But typically 200 and never more than 220.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't know where you're at now. I mean, you like obviously people hold it differently. You look still relatively lean, like just like on your face and everything. So I don't know. I remember hearing you say on I think it was Steve Hall's podcast that you felt like you had bulked up recently and had like basically hit like new like all-time gains, if I'm remembering correctly. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I think I'm a little bit 1 or 2 pounds maybe. Yeah, bigger than before. At least than like the last 2 years or so.
Do you think that was basically due to anything specific or just a longer period of time in the trenches with a long-term surplus?
No, I did have 2 big changes that I think are almost solely responsible for it. Okay. One, I switched away from 2 meals a day, which I strongly prefer personally for adherence. Like in the mornings, I'm never hungry and I don't like spending too much time on food. So 2 meals is great. Also works very well for me when going out to restaurants.
Yeah.
Like I have 1 meal that's small and satiating and very healthy, and then 1 meal at restaurants, so I can fit that in. But it's most likely not optimal. Also, I think last year there was a study that added quite some support for showing that even a third meal, if it's insufficient in protein, is not optimal compared to 3 meals with good protein servings. And I probably spent too much time too lean. Like it started with my contest, which was first delayed, and then I had to switch country. So I was like truly like glute striation lean for probably half a year.
Wow.
And that also changes your reference and everything, right? So after that, I probably stayed excessively lean for 1 or 2 years. And that's probably also not optimal for bulking.
Yeah, no, I would assume not. What is your kind of like natural like comfort zone as far as body fat?
Probably 12% or so. I'd say that 10% I'm more comfortable aesthetically.
Yeah.
But I have to a little bit of effort. Like 12% is super effortless for me.
So you're not really. It's not like you're like naturally just like shredded all the time. I mean,
no,
like
not at all.
So to stay
I was
like
like
2 years.
Pretty chubby before I started this thing.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Not like overweight, but like skinny fat, I guess.
Yeah. So it was a pretty conscious effort then, obviously, to stay that lean for 1 to 2 years. I mean, you had to implement, I guess, a lot of these methods that you use to stay that way.
Yeah, probably my first. I think it goes like that with a lot of people that don't have coaching or like someone doesn't show them the blueprint. Every cut, I managed to get a little leaner in a little bit of a less disastrous way.
Sure.
And over time, it actually became, sustainable, and I learned to properly cut. And then you do photo shoots and everything. I think that also really helps because once you know how to get like super, super lean, then, getting moderately lean you have a much better perspective on that.
Right.
So it's like, every cut you can get to a little bit leaner fat percentage. And at some point you learn, like I said, the long-term goal for people is like, if you can be 10% lean, relatively low effort, or at least like 6-pack lean year round, that's like the gold standard.
Sure. Yeah. So how was your sleep during that time being so lean?
Fine. I have no issues with being lean for my sleep. If anything, I might actually sleep easier. Like definitely no change in sleep quality. Actually, the only time that I feel diet has a big effect on my sleep is when I have a huge meal, especially a high carb meal, very close to bedtime. Then I need very strong air conditioning where it needs to be super cold. Otherwise, I'm just burning up. I'm not sure if that's related to my adaptive metabolism, but it feels like, thermic effect over 9,000.
Right. How about, so like on the way down, even while dieting, you don't have any sleep issues?
Nope. Even in contest prep, sleep's never been an issue for me.
Because I know that's something that
and I have insomnia.
Do you?
Yeah, it's either non-24 or DSPS, but I think DSPS is a bit of a BS diagnosis. It's like delayed sleep phase syndrome. It's more like a description than an actual pathology. So I think my natural rhythm is like 26 hours or something, which means that if you would put me in a room without lights and without sun, etc., like if I'd go to prison and they didn't have a schedule, then I would go to bed like a little later, like 1 or 2 hours later every day. At some point, I just go around the clock,
right?
Because it's not 24-hour biorhythm.
Interesting. So when you say that you don't have issues with sleep during dieting or staying lean, you mean relative to your insomniac self, or what?
No, it's fully under control if I have very meticulous biorhythm. So like I eat at the same times, I go to the gym at the same times, my diet's relatively consistent. No outliers. If I go to bed like a lot later one day, that's immediately a problem. But as long as I go to bed at the same time every day, it's fine. You
travel quite a bit, don't you?
Yeah. So then it's not fine. And then melatonin, light therapy, that helps a lot.
Yeah, I think the research on melatonin is a little bit mixed, but it does seem to help when you're changing time zones.
Which for me is like always.
Right.
It's like my body's like 2 hours behind, and then I need the melatonin to
so do you take it all the time then?
Yes,
melatonin?
Every day.
How much do you take?
3 or 5 milligrams.
Okay, gotcha. And anything time release or just regular?
Regular. I don't notice much of a difference. I think time release, if anything, it only works a bit less well to help me fall asleep. And I think melatonin in general doesn't help you stay asleep.
Yeah, unfortunately.
If anything, if you wake up at night, maybe you take another one, and that can help. But it really doesn't help in a lot of research with staying asleep.
Yeah, unfortunately, because I haven't really noticed any benefit to melatonin, but I have zero issue falling asleep. Like I read a page of a book and I just like pass out. But my issue is staying asleep. Like pretty consistently, I will wake up at 4 a.m. and when it's really tough is when I'm dieting, because that's the first thing to go for me. So when I'm bulking up, no issue. I'm not hungry, so I do wake up. I'll go to the bathroom, and then I just go back to sleep. When dieting,
magnesium citrate pre-bed.
I do take it. I usually don't take it like right before bed. You recommend like right away,
or the last meal within say 4 hours.
Yeah, I have in the past. I could probably implement it again. I take so many supplements and powders and stuff. Not because I'm not a big supplement guy, especially from like a bodybuilding supplements kind of thing. Health wise, I think there's like a decent amount out there, but nothing that's doing anything crazy, obviously. But with the issues with dieting is I will then wake up at, let's say it's like 3 or 4, and I never give in to eating in the middle of the night. Like I don't know if I've ever done that in my life, because I don't want to like get in that pattern of doing that.
No, it makes it worse.
Yeah, but I have definitely found like plenty of times where I'm like, okay, it's 3 or 4, and I cannot get back to sleep. And I've done like there's like CBT sleep and other things they recommend, and I think that's helpful. It's definitely helpful. But that's one of my biggest issues that happens right away. And my understanding is you're not a big believer that dieting affects sleep too much.
No, I generally don't think so, but it could exacerbate, for example, deficiency. And magnesium deficiency is super prevalent. So I think that's one of the few things where I dare bet that research is going to validate it, because research right now on magnesium and sleep is like, there are some hints and indications and a few studies on like people with pathologies, but there isn't any study on people that say they wake up at night and you give them 200 milligrams magnesium citrate with the last meal and then see if it solves the issue. I think anecdotally it does, and it definitely impacts sleep. If you use too much for too long a period, you get crazy vivid dreams. I've seen that in many people, and that's sort of the sign for me that I'm actually probably over supplementing, and then I dial back a bit.
Okay.
And then I also notice for a few days I sleep fine without it, but as soon as like after a week or 2 weeks, especially in keto, and I've actually been blood tested as magnesium deficient in keto once.
Really?
Yeah, because typically you don't consume a lot of high magnesium foods, and there's also some increase in sodium and other electrolyte clearance rates. So,
how much magnesium do you take?
200, like at most. Yeah.
Oh, that's it.
I actually get digestive issues if I take. I followed Poliquin's advice once.
Yeah.
RIP.
Yeah.
And took 2 grams of magnesium, which was mostly oxide. That was like a week of diarrhea.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. So I thought you were going to say significantly higher numbers because so I take about 300 to 350 of magnesium. The timing is not always like exact though. So do you have issues? You would really recommend only taking it at night then, like not like to wake up and
it has to be citrate or some other bioavailable form, but citrate is by far the most common. Most forms of magnesium that you buy commercially, especially oxides, are crap. Like oxide absorption rates like 2% or something.
Yeah, I do take citrate. But I know some people, like I don't know if you follow Peter Attia or if you think he's anything special, but some people are huge fans of his, other people discredit him. But anyway, he talks about how people should be taking like a ton of magnesium. I've heard other people say that just, like basically in that 2 gram dose you're talking about. I never really understood. Yeah, I'm not sure why they recommend that. When I look at, I still use FitDay. I'm still one of the only people I think on that website anymore. But it will usually say my magnesium levels are fine. Now, does the food I'm eating actually have what it's assuming it has? Maybe not. But
yeah, what's fine? Like how many milligrams? Because there's research that strength trainees need like 20% more, and also that magnesium requirements like the RDI is already below optimal.
I think it's like 400 on FitDay. I'll double check, but I'm pretty sure it's relatively high.
It's quite possible that your requirement's like 600. If it's like you're an individual with high requirements plus strength training, etc.
So I'll just pull it up here right now. But yeah, magnesium. So it says RDA 400 milligrams. Yesterday I got 365 plus the 335 or whatever I take. So,
but with supplementation, it should definitely be fine then. But
right. Yeah. So, but no, I know some of the studies that show that sleep isn't affected much like in a deficit. A lot of the ones I've seen cited are short term, where I wouldn't expect too many people to have an issue with it. Other than like if they get in their head, right? But if you're dieting for a week, I wouldn't expect you to have sleep issues. My issue, and I think a lot of people's issues are, okay, now it's been a little while. And again, I do notice it pretty early, but I think on average, people are noticing it weeks and weeks into the diet. They're getting really hungry. And if I recall, I believe I've heard you say that hunger can affect sleep.
Yes. But so both stress and hunger most definitely can affect sleep. So there is definitely indirect pathways by which dieting can harm your sleep.
So if you can diet without stress or hunger, you're fine.
Yeah. I mean, that's possible.
Sure.
But difficult.
Yeah, right. And you said you really don't feel hungry when you're dieting.
No. I eat ad libitum typically when cutting, which means when I'm hungry, I eat. Or rather, I eat at set times, but enough that I don't get hungry and I'm not hungry after the meal anymore.
Yeah. Anything that, I think most of the people listening have, heard a lot of similar to podcasts on like getting lean sustainably. Is there anything that you do that like, other than like, you probably have, I think it looks like 3 meals a day, a lot of like fibrous foods, leaner proteins, anything unusual that you do that helps people do that?
Higher volumes. Eating less, I think, is a big mistake. One of the biggest mistakes that people make. They don't change their food choices, but they just eat less. And that's not sustainable because as you get leaner, your appetite only increases more. The energy expenditure goes down. You have to eat less. So at some point, hunger is basically inevitable.
Yeah.
And you have to eat a lot more volume, a lot more fiber. Most people are like, I get 25 grams of fiber. And I'm like, double it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I guess I could say that, if I'm not hungry, I don't have sleep issues. It's that I get quite hungry. I do eat high volumes of food. I definitely agree. I mean, while I understand, like, I think the whole if it fits your macros concept it did a lot of good for a lot of people to realize like you can still have these things. But as far as practical dieting, I mean, even as far as like most people would consider oatmeal like, high volume and, compared to, I don't know, cereal, like, like a kid's cereal or something. But even then, sometimes I'm like, if I'm really dieting and really hungry, it's like, no, I'd rather have like, 3 pounds of fruit than a cup of oatmeal or something, and it does make it easier. There's a point where I can't out eat the hunger, even with ridiculous amounts of volumes. But like you said, that's usually, pretty far into the diet.
Yep. Yeah, it should be. And then you get to like the finer considerations like texture and different foods and So, I mean, there are a ton of ways you can manipulate the diet satiety index and your own appetite.
Right.
But food volume and fiber and are like the biggest ones. I think and what you said about if it fits your macros is totally spot on. It's like, well, the good news is if you want, you can put a pizza into your macros. The bad news is you're going to be crazy hungry every day.
You're done for like the rest of the day. Yeah. So I have maybe like 2 questions left. Do you have time or do you have to go?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So somebody wanted to ask about recomps, and I think you've talked about recomping a decent amount. I don't know if I've ever in my life like successfully recomped unless, and the caveat is I've never taken time off from the gym, like ever. Like 17 years, I've taken a month off once because I had a pretty big surgery. Right. That's it. So
it's going to be difficult.
Right. And that's kind of what I get into. So do you consider recomping mainly just being for people who are new or off a layoff, or even if somebody's 8 years in, you think you could successfully recomp?
It's like in the middle. So it's like if you're a beginner or you have time off, then you should recomp. Yeah. If you're intermediate, you probably can. If you're advanced, it's going to get difficult. Like me or you, I don't think we're recomping. Yeah. Like it's just not happening. And the important thing to consider is that recomping is not a way you set up the diet. Recomping is the result of optimizing your training and diet and lifestyle and everything. So you're just cutting, as in you're in energy deficit. Yeah. But because you're doing everything optimally, you're now also building muscle. So it's not like I have clients and I'm like, oh, these people I'm going to recomp, these people I'm just going to cut. It's like everyone's cutting, and some people recomp and some people don't. Okay. And if they're very advanced, it's probable that they're not the ones recomping. And even if they've been training 8 years, but they haven't done it super optimally, then they might still recomp. Then typically I see it's like 1 or 2 months of recomping, and after that it's straight cutting.
Yeah. Now, how, like kind of obviously if they're a beginner, this might be different and more noticeable. They might have very noticeable strength gains. But if you're talking like a really slow recomp, somebody lost 10 pounds of fat and maybe they gained 1 pound of muscle. Are there any ways that you're even confirming that it truly was a recomp? But obviously pictures are deceiving, right? You get leaner, you automatically look, more muscular. Are you going by strength gains? Measurements would also probably go down, right? Even if they were to gain some muscle, a lot of the measurements would still go down. So how are you objectively measuring that?
Well, the easiest way is if you have clear indications of fat loss, but no weight loss. So that's the easiest way without DEXA scans. Like I've had many clients with DEXA scans showing it. And sometimes I wasn't even aware. Like I would look at data and it'd be like, oh, it looks really good. Like your caliper readings are way down and you're not losing much weight. So, and your strength is a lot higher. So I'd say good chance you're recomping, but can't say for certain. Then you do the DEXA scan, then you know. Yeah. But if someone's like calipers have been cut in half, weight's still the same, then like you must have recomped. You gain 1 kilo of muscle for every 1 kilo of fat that you lose. Yeah. But that means you're in energy deficit.
Right.
Quite a bit of deficit, in fact, because that 1 kilo of fat is like 9,000. I think on average, adipose tissue is like 8,700. Right. And then lean is like net metabolism, so energy density is like 1,800. I think recently there's even some talk of like it may even just be 1,200.
So you're saying 1 pound of fat is 8,700 calories? Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. I was going to say that. Yeah. That sounds more accurate. Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably the best way to do it. It's funny because like I think DEXA is great. I don't know how accessible it is where you are. Here, I mean, I guess you can do it. I was at a university when I did it, so I was able to do it. I'm not even actually sure like where the average person would like go to do it. So your clients, do they have to see their doctor to get a script?
I never really advise it. Some just have access to it and really want to know. And usually I'm like, well, it's nice, but is very uneconomical.
Yeah.
You know, the effort and the monetary cost are generally not worth it. But if you want to put a number on it, you know, your body fat percentage, then it's a good way to do it. And then here, you know, here's how to do it fast, etc.
Yeah.
But yeah, some people just like it. I've had one or two that one owned the DEXA scan center, and a few were like friends with people there. So then it's easy, you know. Then they can actually do the scan like every once or 2 weeks. But usually it's more like
awesome.
Every couple of months. And I say that probably 80% or more of my clients don't ever do DEXA scans.
Sure. Have you used your caliper formula and kind of lined it up with DEXA results and found it to be fairly accurate?
Yeah, I've tried it a few times. Hit or miss. I think the research is still better, because that's also what research basically does, right? Research validating caliper guidelines. Like you have a 4C or 3C body fat percentage estimate, and then you have a formula that estimates it from calipers, and then you correlate it. So with most of these things, it's like in general with coaches, like you have your client results, and it's cool and all, but you know, you really can't tell that much from it, because there's always multiple factors that are different. And I think a lot of coaches are very easy with that. Well, this is my experience card, you know? Right.
Right. So the last question I wanted to just touch on is, again, going back to training a little bit. It seems like for the longest time, there was a wave of like low volume, like the HIIT guys and DC training and stuff like that. And it's interesting that the research now is showing that if anything, the like non-responders, they just need more volume, which is really in contrast to what was said before, that no, if you're a hard gainer, you need to do low volume. You just need to like focus more on recovery. I have to say, my personal experience is I've had, now again, they kind of know what I talk about, so there's a selection bias there. But I've had a lot of clients come to me and say, I was doing, you know, won't name it, but this person's high volume stuff. And we like cut the volume in half. All of a sudden they're growing, you know. So how do you, like, I guess, can you just touch on that discrepancy between the research and what a lot of people
I'm tempted to align with your anecdotes in this case.
Okay.
In the sense that I think there's a difference between non-responder because not motivated and physical hard gainer. You know, you have some clients that you see their work capacity, the reps, for example, they're like 8, 10, 8, 6. And you're like, are you 1 rep to failure? Yeah, for sure. Like I even did failure sometimes. It's like, I don't think so.
Yeah.
So then it's like, well, we can either first try pushing harder, but then sometimes you see they're just not the people that go close to failure. And then you can add volume to compensate for that. So I think then it's a very sensible strategy. But if you have someone that's like super dedicated, like for example, one client, former professional endurance athlete, super dedicated, became quite strong in some lifts, short guy, just naturally skinny, you know, diet adherence, everything, he got super ripped, like condense lean, basically, to the point where I said, when he came to me and he did the DEXA scan, he was like, the DEXA scan totally off. It said 5% body fat. And I was like, this looks like 5% to me, man.
Yeah, wow.
So he was super dedicated, the strength, everything, all the indications are just super dedicated guy, does not handle high volume very well. So, and often what you also see is they get injured. So maybe the muscles could handle it, but in practice you still see that they get injured. So, and then, you know, sort of burned out from that. I think that's an area of research that's still very underseen. Like we define recovery capacity. In research, often we're only talking about neuromuscular fatigue, but in practice, we're often talking about a mix of mental exhaustion, actual neuromuscular fatigue, like the muscles not being able to handle it, and injuries. You know, a lot of people, when they say like they do high volume, they get injured. They say like, I respond poorly to high volume.
Yeah.
But they don't know if like their muscles are actually not thriving on it underneath. And there might be a discrepancy between what your connective tissues and what your muscles can handle.
In that guy's example, one, would you still remain high frequency and just do lower volume? And two, if you could determine that it was that simply like his body, his ligaments and things like that could not handle it, could you find a way to go back to high volume, but use easier methods, maybe exercises that aren't as taxing, maybe blood flow restriction, things like that?
Yes, I typically err on the side of keeping high frequency in, because the research actually suggests quite strongly, based on testosterone to cortisol ratio and a few other markers, that high frequency training is, if anything, easier to recover from than lower frequency training with the same total volume. Whereas the total work tonnage typically goes up. So it's a pretty good ratio of stimulus to fatigue. So I don't think you should cut frequency. Like maybe when you get, you want to do at least one productive set per exercise, and maybe even two, or some people feel unsatisfied if you only do one set.
Yeah.
So there's like a lower limit. And if you're training 3 times a day or twice a day, then it would be weird. But in normal context, yeah, keep the frequency high. And for injuries, don't compromise on volume, and definitely not frequency, unless absolutely needed. So I think that is the big take home. Like if you get injured, but you're still progressing well in strength and everything, so the indications are the progress was good, but you got injured, then try to work around it. See if you have other squat variations that make your hips feel better. Do front squats, for example, if it's your hips. Switch to other exercise. Maybe switch up the exercises a bit more. Go with higher reps. Those kind of things. But try to keep the volume in, at least for muscle growth.
Yeah, there's a argument I've seen a couple people make. I don't know if there's really any research behind it, but the idea that as you get more advanced, you need a certain per session volume to be sufficient stimulus. Again, I'm not sure if there's really any credibility behind it. I understand what they're saying, like, okay, you need X amount of stimulus, and you can't do that in, one set per, workout, even if you did 7 workouts. I'm sure this is not the first time you're hearing this. So what's your kind of rebuttal to that?
Yeah, I don't think there's any empirical evidence to support that. I think it's a very plausible theory, but it's simply not what we see in research. There have been plenty of studies where people do one set, very trained individuals. You see increases in protein synthesis, there's muscle damage. All the responses are ongoing. There's no effect. There's no effect at all of any like threshold effect. If anything, the research very strongly suggests the diminishing returns principle, but research on like sort of a threshold effect, other than the hard gainers, where you can wonder if it's like hard training or like actual genetic thing, is really not. There's nothing suggesting like you need the minimum threshold. Like there is such a thing, of course, but it's one hard set, basically.
Right.
So if you repeat that every day, then you're already at 7 sets per week.
Right. Yeah, which is interesting because I could understand. I could see it being, like you said, plausible. I think there are other avenues where maybe that would apply. Like, if you're like, well, endurance training, like if you're training for a marathon, you can't just keep doing daily miles. Like eventually you have to have this crazy stimulus. If you look at like, negative reactions in the body, right? Certain toxins, you can have a little bit every day, but like a giant bolus of it's going to cause problems. But as you said, I've never seen anything supporting it muscularly. So
the thing is, with the weights, there's progressive overload, or there should be in a good program.
Right.
So it's not like if you're only doing 100 times 8 on the bench press every time, then yeah, you're not going to get any results from that. But that's not what we're doing. It's 102.5, 105 times 8, 107.5 times 8, etc.
Right. Gotcha. Awesome, man. Well, I'm glad we got to make this work. I appreciate you taking the time. I will have links to everything for you down below. And where can people find you? Great.
MennoHenselmans.com is my website, where you can find pretty much everything. Best way to get to know me, if you don't yet, is if you go to my website, MennoHenselmans.com. On the homepage at the top, you can subscribe to my email course, and then you get like a tour of my most popular contents and stuff that people generally liked. So yeah, I'd say that's the best way. And of course, I'm on Instagram and Facebook.
All right. Awesome. Thanks again, man.
My pleasure.